Okay, greetings everyone. This is Rowe. This is going to be my critical response number one for the current Noah's Flood debate that's taking place. And my response will be directed towards Jen Fishburne. I don't actually have a response to Joel's opening because even though I was advocating for a local historical flood context in light of the scriptures, Joel, before the debate, Joel knew that I held to an ancient Near Eastern perspective as well. I readily acknowledge the ancient Near Eastern context behind the all of primeval history in Genesis, whether you're speaking about Genesis 1 all the way up to Genesis 11. So I guess my remarks are entirely focused on Jen's opening, and most likely I will then make a response toward Joel if he does bring up any specific issues in his critical remarks to what I was saying. Okay, let's get started. So, I'm just going to highlight the areas of disagreement I have with Jen, specifically the way they'll be appearing in the papers. I'll have it in italics, and then my response will be just the general script. So here we go. So Jen first states, and by the way, this is in chronological order of her opening. In this debate, none of us will present 100% conclusive position. Much of what each of us presents will be conjecture, although that should be based upon as many facts as possible. So that's what Jen states. My response is this. There's a sense of ambiguity here about how models are presented, especially in academia. At least in my presentation as well as Joel's, there isn't much conjecture at play when real data is gathered. Mine focused on real history, while Joel focused on legitimate ancient Near Eastern traditions that I personally don't disagree with. Last year, I wrote a blog post on this very issue that's apparent within Christendom. Since we require our doctors, surgeons, architects, chemists, psychologists, and engineers to have formal training and degrees, what does it imply about our view of theology and the Bible when that happens to be the only field where formal training is regularly looked upon with askance? I'm not suggesting that Jen is asking us to park our brains at the door. However, a flippant remark that everything boils down to conjecture does a disservice for how academia and the scientific method that emerged from Christian theology within the church has operated over the last 2,000 years. Heeding the encouragement of Paul that the church is indeed a vehicle by which God's unending wisdom can be demonstrated and unfolded. The irony is that false theories have conjured up the right responses. For example, the Nicene Creed was a result of Arianism, or Arianism, how you want to pronounce that. We need to thank Arius and anyone who produces unfounded models for the truths to come to light. Such is the case with the recent emergence of younger creationism, stemming ultimately from Ellen G. White's erroneous ideas, where science education has had a mostly positive effect on those indoctrinated by this cult. However, I will admit that there are unfortunate circumstances of apostasy, since those who leave the faith after the young earth creationism has been debunked think that the young earth creationist model is the only form of reality within Scripture. In Genesis, so then Jen writes, in Genesis 1, we have the creation of the heavens and the earth. Notice it does not say world or universe there. And unfortunately, all scholars that specialize in the Hebrew language, they all disagree. The definite article in the Hebrew specifies the observable universe, and therefore it's understood to be a merism, a combination of opposites, expressing the totality of cosmic phenomena, for which there is no single word in biblical Hebrew. Jen then writes, the Hebrew for create is bara, which does not mean to make something out of nothing, although God is certainly capable of doing so. Bara means to fashion or form raw materials into something usable. In a crude analogy, we use ingredients to form a cake. Again, the prior extensive footnote should be sufficient in refuting this. However, a further clarification in that the verb bara refers to the production of something new, where God is the subject, never man. When it takes an object of the thing created, it never indicates any pre-existent material out of which it is made. Then Jen writes, verse 2 denotes a birth, like that of a watery sack. Oh, she's speaking about Genesis 1 verse 2 here. So Genesis 1 verse 2 denotes a birth, like that of a watery sack, which contains a baby. The baby is inside the womb all along, but it is surrounded by water, and there is no real form or substance in the beginning. Though this is curiously imaginative, as I pointed out in my opening, Genesis 1 verse 2 showcases that the universe has a finite start. In Genesis 1 verse 1, Genesis 1 verse 1 showcases that the universe has a finite start. In Genesis 1 verse 2, the first condition of early Earth was its unformed and desolate state, that then paved the way, after the Theia impact event to form the moon, for it to become a water world due to cometary influx during the late heavy bombardment period. And thus it was dark on the surface due to the sunlight not being able to penetrate the opaque atmosphere of Earth, explicitly detailed in Job 38 verse 9. In Genesis 1 verse 3, the divine act of God to create life in the early oceans paved the way for light to finally penetrate a translucent atmosphere. The early organisms transform the atmosphere via the carbonate-silicate cycle. She then says the proponents of the Big Bang Theory believe that everything began with a burst of light. That seems to match up with verse 3, doesn't it? And that's not the case. Read above. Verse 3 is specifically speaking about what's happening on the surface of the planet when light is shining through. So let there be light, and then verses 4 and 5 get into the differentiation of the day and night cycle. So you can't say Big Bang, which then 300,000 years later you have the cosmic microwave background, the separation of light and darkness, and then somehow that connects with the day and night cycle. I think that's stretching it. So both the Bible and the scientists agree that light was there before the sun. And in this context, it depends on what you mean by light. What's the context of this word light? The merism in verse 1 includes the existence of the sun. Furthermore, the grammar in verse 14, so Genesis 1 verse 14, is important since haya has a complementary infinitive. Thus, lihabdel expresses a purpose. Let the lights be for separating. Therefore, the author was not communicating that the fourth day was an account of the creation of the sun, but that the heavenly lights have already been created in the beginning to finally have its functional purpose. Likewise, since vegetation appears on the third day, the lack of a sun proposes a significant problem. For Earth to be hospitable, many solar characteristics must be in check. In the absence of the sun, Earth's orbital path, rotation, atmosphere, oceans, continents, and water cycle would suffer catastrophic consequences. If the sun was dropped into place on the fourth day, the gravitational perturbations would have radically altered Earth and instantly destroyed all life. As a way around these enormous complications, some young Earth creationist leaders suggest that God could have radically altered physics. Yet, as I point out in my opening argument, both biblical texts and astronomical observations support the conclusion that God did not alter the natural laws. For example, Jeremiah 33:25 explicitly refers to the fixed laws of the universe. And in that verse, you have the merism phrase, heavens and earth, appearing there. And Romans 8, verse 20 to 22 states that the corrupting bondage, which I believe to be an apt description of the second law of thermodynamics, applies to, quote, all the rest of creation, in verse 22. Astronomically, because of the time required for light to travel from stars and galaxies to astronomers' telescopes, observations of distant sources provide a direct and faithful record of the state of the physical laws and constants throughout cosmic history. Astronomers see no evidence from any past era for even a tiny change in physical laws or constants. Observations show that possible variations must be less than 2 parts per, let's see, so this is million, billion, trillion, so yeah, 10,000 trillion per year over the past 12 billion years. And laboratory measurements limit possible variations to as little as 4 parts per, so million, billion, trillion, so 100,000 trillion per year. That's ridiculously small. Thus, research confirms that the laws and constants of physics have operated invariably and continuously throughout cosmic history, including the creation days. This exegetical approach of the fixity of the laws of nature not only arises from a modern understanding of the structure and formation of stars and planets, but also dates back to at least the 1680s. Jen then writes, I tend to think that the 2 trees in the garden, whether literal or not, were representative of Jesus and a watcher. This watcher was a god, and Enoch tells us that these gods taught mankind all sorts of things. Jen's on the right track, but the details are vague. From an ancient Near Eastern context, many parallels to Genesis 2:9 exist, and thus can further inform us on what the, quote, tree of life is, starting with the Mesopotamian tale of Adapa, dating to the 14th century BC. We find the main character as the first of these semi-divine sages, known as an Apkallu, who served as counselors, Umanu, to the antediluvian kings, bringing the arts of civilization to humanity. To summarize the story, Adapa is fishing one day while a south wind arises and overturns his boat, throwing him into the sea. Angered by this, he breaks the wings of the south wind so that for 7 days it cannot blow. The sky god Anu calls Adapa to account in heaven for this misdeed. His father, the god Ea, warns him not to eat or drink anything in heaven, as Ea fears that the food and drink of death will be set before Adapa. However, like the divine command to Adam to eat from all the trees, including the tree of life in Genesis 2:16, the offer of the food of life and the waters of life to Adapa implied an offer of eternal life. Adapa refuses them, and thus failing to achieve immortality, he is compelled to return to Earth. On the left over here, you see an iconographical picture showcasing 2 Apkallus on the left. You have the bird and fish type, then you have a sacred tree in the middle, and then you have this divine figure like a king on the right. In this photo here, so here's a wall painting from the burial chamber of Pharaoh Thutmose III, where the ruler is suckled by a breast protruding from a sycamore tree. So here's the breast, and he's drinking from the breast. And here's an arm that extends from the tree to help the breast feed this person. Such trees are portrayed as objects of beauty, grandeur, and abundant fertility, They become shelters for all sorts of creatures and are a source of sustenance for all life. The concepts of a supernatural tree as a source of life by eating and drinking a substance to gain divine powers have coalesced into the tree of life motif. Thus, throughout ancient Near Eastern literature, occasional descriptions of sacred trees with magical powers are known. For example, the Kiskanu tree is referred to in Akkadian incantation and magical texts as having some special powers. Um, in this photo here, you have what's called the cosmic tree, which is very evident in Ezekiel 31 and compared with Daniel 4. So on the left, we see this depiction where the inhabited world is an enormous tree watered by roots in the cosmic deep and rising with its top in the clouds. Every living being finds shelter in its boughs and shade. In Ezekiel 31, the reference to the quote tree of life, along with Eden, so in Ezekiel 31, and the Garden of God blend these ancient themes with the biblical creation narrative. Here's another one where you have the Egyptian goddess Hathor, or sometimes it's Isis, or sometimes it's Nut, was portrayed as a gigantic sycamore tree with roots sunk deep down to the subterranean waters and whose top reached heaven. They provided the dead with protection and daily nourishment. Thus, the image of a cosmic tree offering nourishment and protection in Ezekiel 31 represents the Hebrew version of the Egyptian iconographic cosmic tree. The lower world, which would be the roots, is the abode of the dead. The middle world, which is the trunk, contains the essence of all things, which, in their thinking, the real world, which is behind our visible world. And the upper world, which would be the branches, contain everything that exists inside and outside our cosmos. Thus, the equivalent of the lower world in the Bible is Sheol, the abode of the dead. The equivalent of the middle world in the Bible is the earth, but more specifically as a concept of the axis mundi, or the navel of the world, and thus another form of cosmic tree imagery. In summary, all of this background imagery is to help us see that the quote-unquote tree of life culminates into a symbolic representation of the cross, since the Greek word xylon most often refers to either the cross or tree in the New Testament, and the two images are well connected. In other words, it is the cross of Christ that produces life and make it possible to inherit God's paradise. We see that this is exactly the thinking of early Christians, where the tree of life was readily identified with the cross and therefore with Christ himself. And I could pick many examples, but I chose one, which is a very early one, a mosaic, Roman Catholic basilica in the 5th century, showing the assimilation of the ancient Near Eastern cosmic tree motif. Stylized vegetation of the cosmic tree spans heaven and earth in vine-like scrolls that you can see over here. Two liturgical lamps flank its main trunk. So I don't know if it's easy to see, but here's lamp 1, here's lamp 2. Human and animals seek its shade and fruit. Baptism is shown by the water of life issuing from the base of the tree, which in this case is also the cross, in the form of the 4 rivers that flowed out of Eden. 2 thirsty deers that represent the image of the soul longing for God, which would be from Psalm 41 verse 1. So Psalm 42 verse 1 has the 2 deers drinking, and so that's the imagery there. You have 2 thirsty deers there, drinking from the water of life. Below them stand the Lamb, so the Lamb of God, in the celestial city. And so therefore, in this single image, the cross erected on Golgotha in the historical city of Jerusalem at a particular moment in human history is here revealed as the eternal cosmic tree of life, prefigured from the beginning in Eden, and finally revealed in all its glory in God's paradise. So ranging from ancient Near Eastern tradition down to Jesus, why this overlap? Well, it shouldn't surprise us that the biblical writers use terms, symbols, and concepts derived from popular mythology to address their audiences. It is crucial to observe that the use of such concepts did not obligate any biblical writer to adopt the theological mindset of their sources. Where the language of myth was countenanced in the Old Testament writings, it carried with it a very different meaning for Israel than for the pagan nations of the ancient Near East. As a literary phenomenon, the usage of mythological allusions is widespread in many later cultures, and the fact that such references might appear in literary productions is no indication that the writer is necessarily committed to any underlying theology, or that he does more than merely approve of the suitability of the allusion as part of the process of human communication. It also implicitly demonstrates that Yahweh is not bound to any particular means of communicating his message. He is sovereign even over the polytheistic myths that would deny his uniqueness. This sovereignty is demonstrated um, most fully when biblical writers attribute to Yahweh in greater degree the positive characteristics of other ancient Near Eastern gods. So, like Yahweh is the cloud rider, just like Baal is the cloud rider, and so on. Okay, so then Jen writes, so beginning with the knowledge of evil upon the face of the earth, since it had spread across the whole continent of Pangaea. I'm sorry, Pangaea was during the Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras, well before humans arrived into the Persian Gulf oasis 70,000 years ago. So during the Pleistocene, late Pleistocene era, Pangaea did not exist. It definitely did not exist at the time of Noah's flood. So then Jen writes, in order to save this tiny remnant, God told Noah what he was planning to do, and gave Noah instructions to build an ark, basically some kind of floating box out of wood. Again, as I made in my opening argument, the ark was a small reed boat, probably the size of a modern yacht. As I point out in my opening argument, Genesis 6:14 can be read, make for yourself a vessel of stalks from a reed hut. With reeds you will make the vessel and tar it inside and out with bitumen. It is likely that Noah had at least 100 years in which to accomplish this. Again, this is, to be honest, quite ridiculous. The mention of the 120 years in Genesis 6:3 is a base 60 representation of the sexagesimal 1200 years that you see in the Akkadian text of Atrahasis, and that depiction is 600.600. Jen then writes, if Noah and his family couldn't figure out how to take a few animals found only in the neck of the woods and get 100 miles away from home within 100 years, then this otherwise amazing story should be called, quote, Noah the village idiot who survived Hurricane Noah. We would actually laugh and make memes of this guy if this story happened today. This is mere ignorance on animal behavior relative to farming methods. As I point out in my opening argument, these particular species would mostly comprise of farm animals along with any local wild fauna. So, in the Persian Gulf region. I don't want to stray too much from what I've written here. So, that being said, animals and humans do not migrate away from available sustenance, such as the Persian Gulf oasis, and neither do they migrate over mountainous regions. The Arabian Peninsula is surrounded by mountains and ocean waters. So you have the Hijaz Mountains at the southwest, then you have the Armenian Mountains on the northeast, and the waters are where the Red Sea is and basically where the Indian Ocean is. And again, in that location, migration would involve leaving behind everything, and it's just Noah and the humans hopefully trying to survive elsewhere. And that is the most illogical, non-logistical tactic to make. Um, so it would be ludicrous for Noah to move. The only solution was to survive this flooding. However, is it possible that anyone else may have survived the flood by not being localized in the region 13,000 years ago? So 13,000 years ago is the ballpark of when the flood happened. It's a high probability. I don't mind arguing that humans other than Noah survived, um, and naturally other species survived. So since Noah's Ark rested on Mount Judy, just south of the Armenian Mountains, this aligns well with the flora, olive trees, and wine production, for example, that is mentioned later in the Genesis text. So this aligns well with the flora within that region. In fact, DNA fingerprinting studies have helped us understand genes of wild wheat to those of cultivated wheat, showing that large-scale agriculture began roughly 10,000 years ago. The location for this launch was near the Karakodag Mountains in southern Turkey, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers run close together. And again, this matches the proximity of Mount Judy and the landing of Noah's Ark. The same DNA analysis also outlined the spread of organized agriculture throughout Mesopotamia's Fertile Crescent, uh, roughly 9,000 to 8,000 BC, to Persia, the Nile Delta, India, and Greece, which is roughly 8,000 to 6,000 BC, and beyond to South Central Europe, which in this case would be the remainder of Egypt, and southern Russia and Arabia, is roughly 6,000 to 5,000 BC. And so this spread, starting where Mount Judy is and spreading out, is consistent with the biblical chronology outlined in Genesis 10 to 11 for the spread of advanced human civilization. So Australian Aborigines would be roughly 40,000 years ago. They are already in Australia 27,000 years prior to Noah's flood. And then the last point, Jen says, well, actually not the last argument she makes, but the last point that I could fit into my response, because I was only limited to a 6-page response. The size of the ark in the Bible is given in cubits. And again, this is a base 16 measurement. Whether you are looking at Genesis or the other flood myths, they all have in common the fact that the dimensions are impractical. None of them could have possibly been seaworthy. When we look into shipbuilding throughout history, the earliest vessels were rarely more than 10 feet in length and were made of skin and reeds, generally sailed in the marshes and along riverbanks. Soon after, Egyptian art, as clearly as the Old Kingdom in 2500 BC, depict ships that may be as long as 170 feet. Even when we move into Roman times, the most famous large vessel was the Isis, which sailed between Alexandria and Rome. Remarkably, it was 180 feet by 45 feet by 44 feet, which is less than 25% at the size of the Ark, less than a quarter. Moving to the 19th century, the Wyoming is listed at 449 feet, but this includes the gibbet boom, which would therefore be, its actual length would be 329 feet. These modern long wooden boats are also built with iron bolts and steel supports, something not available to Noah. A literary factor toward hyperbole has a better explanation, and this is called academic arithmetic. Academic arithmetic is what and it's in the footnote from Andrew George, the Tower of Babel, that when they construct ziggurats, they actually in the blueprint design planning, they give these very elaborate figures, but the actual construction itself is ridiculously a lot smaller than what was planned in the document. So then the question is, why did they do that? That's why you have this word academic, because the academic is to be an educational tool. So students who learn how to construct these things, they're given these elaborate figures because it's an academic tool to teach them how to build this stuff. But then when the real scale construction takes place, then from a high value figure, they then are able to reduce it down to real world scales and what they could actually build, for example. So you have this in the ancient Near East, this thing called academic arithmetic, very ancient practice. And so therefore, I wouldn't be surprised if such literary figures uh, were given, uh, uh, you know, not just in the Genesis account, but also in many other ancient Near Eastern accounts. So, and finally, since I've reached my page limit, I shall refrain from further comment. I believe that most of what I write in my opening already deals with the rest of Jen's statements in her opening. But in my second response, added writing space will allow me to see how Jen and Joel have been critical of my work, and likewise will offer my thoughts relative to their openings and first rebuttals. So if this seems a really short and it seems like I spent a lot of time on the Tree of Life imagery and so on, and not so much on the flood. In this case, I apologize because there were so many things that Jen mentioned that I want to, in broad brush strokes, try and respond to each. And I guess in my second rebuttal, which again I'm supposing is either 5 or 6 pages, I will be a lot more stricter in what to respond to and so on. So, but these are points that I also wanted to touch on at the same time. So let's see how that goes. Okay. Thank you for um, hearing my response to these things, and I hope it's been helpful. God bless.